The early church was not Trinitarian, and there is no better place to look for this than in the writings of Tertullian and his letter to Praxeas. Now, Tertullian wrote his letter in the 3rd century, and this is an eye-opener for all of us, because Tertullian stated this. He said that the majority of believers were startled at the dispensation of the 3 in 1. In other words, the majority of believers were not receiving lightly or not accepting the Trinity that was being expounded by Tertullian and all of the Ante-Nicene fathers. According to Tertullian, the majority of believers were not Trinitarian. And if they were not Trinitarian, what were they? Well, when you study the writings of the Ante-Nicene fathers, and when you go to the Bible especially, you will see clearly that the early church was not Trinitarian. It was what we call oneness, or Jewish monotheist, or as Tertullian called them in the 3rd century, monarchian. What Tertullian was really saying during his time, the 3rd century, was that Trinitarians were a small minority, and they were going up against the majority of believers, and they were not being very successful, because the majority of believers were accusing Tertullian and the rest of the Ante-Nicene fathers. They were accusing them of being preachers of 2 and 3 gods. How do we know this? Because Tertullian wrote about it, and he placed it clearly in his writings that they were not accepting his theology. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote in Acts 20, well, it's supposed to be Luke who wrote it about Paul, but Paul said this. He said that after his departure would grievous wolves come in. And he also said that even among them, the elders of Ephesus, would some of them rise up to teach false doctrines. Now, this is what is amazing. If the majority of believers were not Trinitarian, and they were startled when Tertullian was teaching on the 3 in 1, then the wolves in sheep's clothing were not the oneness believers. No, the wolves in sheep's clothing were the apostolic and Ante-Nicene fathers, including Tertullian. And my final point is that Tertullian was making it known that the Trinity was rejected by the majority of believers. No wonder we have a Council of Nicaea, and no wonder we have a Council of 381, where the Roman Catholic Church persecuted the Christians and the Jews. No wonder this is happening. No wonder this took place. Why? Because the majority of believers did not accept the Trinity. They rejected it. And so the only way that Rome could make believers accept this Trinity was by persecution. So whenever you hear a modern Trinitarian tell you that the early church was Trinitarian, refer him to the letter that Tertullian wrote against Praxeas. And if they tell you that oneness believers are heretics, tell them that the ones who invaded the church in the 3rd century, I'm not even talking about the 1st and 2nd century, but in the 3rd century, were the Trinitarians